She spilled the wine in front of everyone. Gasps filled the room as all eyes turned to her. But when the guest looked up, his hands started shaking, and what he said next made the entire hall go silent. Before we begin, comment what city you're watching from. And at the end, rate this story from 0 to 10. She walked in like a ghost no one had invited, barefoot. Her hair slightly wet from the drizzle outside. Her dress wrinkled from the plastic bag she had pulled it out of behind the parking lot dumpster. The grand ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers, each crystal reflecting privilege, grace, and generational wealth, and she didn't belong to any of it, not even a little. The music was loud, the laughter even louder, and no one noticed her at first as she hovered awkwardly near the punch table, arms wrapped around her shivering body. But it only took one small accident, her elbow brushing against a service tray, for everything to go terribly silent. A glass of red wine soared in the air, turning slowly in the bright lights like a scene from a slow-motion film, and then it landed, exploding all over the front of a man's blindingly white tuxedo. Gasps erupted from nearby guests. Heads turned like a wave rolling through the crowd. The woman's heart stopped, her mouth parted in shock, but no words came out. She instinctively reached for a napkin, but someone else beat her to it, a tall woman in emerald green with eyes sharp as daggers. "She's not even a guest," the woman hissed, brushing the wine off the man's chest with the back of her hand before glaring down at the intruder. "She snuck in. Call security." The barefoot girl lowered her head, murmuring apologies that no one really listened to. But then something happened. The man, the one now drenched in wine, hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. He simply stared at her face. And in that exact moment, his fingers started trembling. His jaw clenched ever so slightly. His eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes used to analyzing billion-dollar contracts, widened with something unspoken. He took a step forward, looking like he'd seen a ghost from another life. He didn't care about the wine, not one bit. Because the girl in front of him, this stranger who appeared out of nowhere in the middle of his engagement party, looked exactly like someone he had been trying to forget for years. He stood frozen, not because of the ruined tuxedo or the shocked guests gathering around, but because the woman before him had a face he thought he would never see again in this lifetime. There was something hauntingly familiar in the way her eyes searched the floor, in the way her fingers trembled slightly as she tried to gather the courage to speak. His fiancée rushed to his side, whispering frantic questions and tugging at his sleeve, but he barely registered her presence. His mind was pulled backward to a night long ago, in a city park dimly lit by broken lamps, when he had once given his last $10 to a stranger sitting on a bench with a swollen lip and a paper bag full of broken dreams. He remembered that face because it had stared at him with disbelief back then, as if no one had ever looked at her like a human being before. And now, standing in front of him again, she looked the same, like someone trying to disappear into the floor, praying not to be seen but needing to be saved. A security guard pushed through the crowd, already speaking into his walkie-talkie, asking whether the woman had been invited. A woman at the dessert table insisted she saw her come in from the back. Another guest chuckled and called it good drama for a boring party. But the man in the ruined tuxedo said nothing. He was still watching her. Not just looking, studying every feature on her face, every shiver, every embarrassed flicker of her eyelids. And as the guard reached for her arm, he did something no one expected. He spoke her name. Full voice. Clear. Certain. Like a man not guessing but remembering. The music had stopped. The service stood still. And the woman turned her head up with disbelief written all over her tear-streaked face. Lips trembling as the sound of her own name echoed inside her chest like a long-lost secret she didn't know was still alive. When he said her name aloud, Alina, the room didn't just fall silent. It held its breath as if every molecule of air had suddenly paused to witness what would happen next. It wasn't the name itself that stunned the guests, but the conviction with which he said it. No hesitation, no question mark in his tone. Just raw, unmistakable familiarity, as if he'd been carrying that name inside him all these years like a scar that never fully healed. The woman froze. Her lips parted slightly but no sound came out. Her eyes widened with disbelief, not because he had spoken her name, but because he had remembered it. People don't usually remember the names of those they pass by on the street, let alone someone they'd only met for one fleeting act of kindness under a flickering street lamp. But he had. The security guard lowered his hand, now visibly confused, his posture shifting from firm to awkward. The murmurs began again among the guests, this time not with laughter but with uncertainty. The bride-to-be's smile faltered, her fingers still clutching the groom's wrist as if to remind him where he was, what he was doing, what this day was supposed to be about. But he didn't look at her. His eyes never left Elena. "Elena? Is that really you?" he asked, not with pity, but with something closer to regret, like a man who'd realized too late that fate had given him a single shot at something meaningful, and he had walked away from it without knowing. Her voice was soft, raspy, barely audible above the weight of her own heart pounding inside her chest. You remember me?" He nodded slowly, the memories crashing into him like a tide that had been held back for far too long. "I do. The park. You had a bruised lip. You said you'd lost everything that day." She tried to smile, but it cracked before it could form. "I didn't just lose my apartment or my job that day. I lost the last person who looked at me like I was still human. Until you." There it was, an invisible string stretched across time and circumstance. From that cold bench in a forgotten park to this ornate ballroom, filled with judgmental eyes and meaningless chatter. And the string had held, all these years, all this silence. And it still held. His fiancée stepped forward now, planting herself between them with a brittle laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "You know this woman?" she asked sharply, trying to keep her voice level. He hesitated, not because he didn't know how to answer, but because he suddenly realized just how much he did. For the first time in years, he turned away from the expectations tethered to his name, his wealth, and the polished persona he'd worn like armor since his early 20s. He looked at Elena, not as a stranger from the past, not as the homeless woman thrown out minutes ago, but as the one unfinished chapter in a life he thought had already been written. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady but soaked in emotion. "I know her. Not just as a name I remember or someone I once helped. I know her as the reason I stopped being numb." The words hit the room like a rogue wave. His fiancée stiffened beside him, her fingers no longer holding his wrist but curled into fists at her side. Some guests glanced toward each other in disbelief. Others began whispering behind trembling champagne glasses, but no one interrupted. They all wanted to know what he meant, how this elegant man in a custom-tailored tuxedo could be tied in any way to the soaked girl standing barefoot on their imported marble floors. "She gave me something that day I didn't even know I was missing," he continued, his gaze never leaving Elena's eyes. "I was spiraling. Everyone thought I had it all, money, power, freedom, but I was barely hanging on. I had just buried my father. I hadn't spoken to my brother in years. I didn't even know what joy looked like anymore. Until she handed me a napkin soaked in her own tears and told me, 'If it still hurts, you're still human.'" A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I never forgot that," he said. "I built everything I have after that moment. But I never told anyone the real reason why I got up again. Because it was her." Eleanor's knees felt weak. Not because of the cold, or the shock of being recognized in front of 100 elite strangers, but because she was finally being seen, not pitied. Not ignored, seen. His fiancée laughed dry, sharp, wounded. "So what? Are you saying you've been carrying some romantic fantasy about a homeless woman all these years? Is that it? You're going to throw this all away for her?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped away from her and walked slowly toward Elena. Each step felt like shedding a layer of denial, a layer of obligation, a layer of who he was supposed to be. When he reached her, he didn't touch her. He didn't say anything. He simply knelt, not in worship, not in apology, but in reverence, and said quietly, "You saved me once. Let me return the favor." The silence that followed his words wasn't empty, it was dense. It had weight, the kind of silence that makes people afraid to even breathe, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever is shifting beneath the surface. His fiancée didn't take it well. She stepped forward, heels clicking like gunshots on the marble, her expression carved from rage and disbelief. Her voice, sharp enough to cut glass, sliced through the tension. You kneel for her? After everything we've built, after everything I sacrificed for this wedding for you, you choose her? He stood up slowly, not with defiance, but with a calm that unnerved her more than shouting ever could. You built this wedding, he said, but you didn't build me. The room flinched. She let out a laugh, bitter and trembling, like someone who knew she was losing but refused to walk away with grace. You think this makes you noble? A man in a suit, chasing a fantasy from the streets? What's next? You marry her in the parking lot? But he didn't answer her. Because in that moment, Elena swayed slightly, not from emotion, but from exhaustion. The cold, the shame, the confrontation, it had drained her. He caught her by the arm before she could collapse, and it was the first time anyone in the room saw her as human, not a spectacle. The first time they saw the girl, not the label. And that's when something unexpected happened. One of the older guests, a quiet woman in a soft lavender dress who hadn't said a word all night, stood up from her chair. She looked directly at Elena and said, "Would you like to sit with me, dear?" Then another hand was raised. And another. One by one, guests who had clutched their pearls and whispered their judgments only moments earlier now stood not in protest, but in quiet acknowledgement. Not because they understood everything, but because they finally saw something real. The groom helped Elena to a nearby chair. Someone offered her a shawl. Someone else brought her a glass of water. And without saying it, without declaring anything dramatic or theatrical, the crowd shifted. But his fiancée? She took a deep breath, turned on her heel, and walked away graceful in defeat, but vanishing like a flame snuffed out too late. What no one noticed was that the groom never looked back, not even once. As the guests slowly resumed their seats, uncertain whether the ceremony would continue or had already transformed into something else entirely, he stood beside her. Elena sat with the shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her posture still tense, still ready to run if she had to. The warmth of kindness was foreign to her, and it sat on her skin like sunlight after too long in the dark. He knelt beside her again, this time quietly, without any drama or expectation. Just a man who needed to see her, up close, without the noise. And when their eyes met, something flickered behind his. Not pity, not curiosity, recognition. His brows furrowed slightly. He tilted his head like he was trying to remember a dream that kept slipping away just before he woke up. "I know you," he said, almost to himself. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She didn't want to admit it, but something about him had felt familiar too. Not his face, but his voice, the calm in it, the warmth underneath the control. "You used to sing," he said quietly, "in that old park by 8th and Jefferson. You had a yellow scarf and a blue guitar case, always cracked open like a broken promise." She froze. No one had remembered that. That scarf had been lost years ago, and the guitar had been stolen while she was sleeping under the overpass. She hadn't sung in front of people since. That park had been her last refuge before everything went cold. "You gave me a sandwich once," he added. "I was 15. I had just run away. No one else looked at me like I was worth saving. Now it was her turn to go silent. Because the boy she gave that sandwich to, he had tears in his eyes and dirt on his cheeks. And she had told him to go home, not because she thought he would, but because she hoped someone would say that to her one day too. I went back the next day," he said. "You were gone." The silence between them was no longer empty. It pulsed with a weight neither of them could explain. Around them, the wedding had turned into background noise. The murmurs, the glances, even the music trying to play off the awkwardness, none of it mattered. He didn't stand up to make a statement. He didn't raise his voice to defend her. He simply reached forward and took her hand. This time not to help her off the ground, not to rescue her from shame, but to anchor himself in something real. Her fingers hesitated. They were rough, weathered, unpolished by comfort, but his grip didn't flinch. If anything, it tightened gently, as if he was afraid she'd disappear again. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking just slightly, "for what they did. And for what I didn't do." Elena blinked hard. She didn't want to cry. She had trained herself not to. On the street, tears were currency you couldn't afford to spend. But something about this, about being remembered not as a burden, but as a moment of grace in someone else's story, was too much. "You don't owe me anything," she whispered. He shook his head slowly. "Maybe not. But I owe her," he nodded toward the girl in the yellow scarf, the one from the past, something. For the first time that night she smiled, not wide, not dramatic, but soft, tired, honest. And somehow that smile cracked something open in the room. It wasn't just him who saw it. The guests, those who had clutched their pearls, who had stared with suspicion and judged in whispers, were now silent, some out of confusion, others out of shame. A man who had everything had stopped everything for her. And in that quiet space, Elena did something no one expected. She stood, not because someone helped her, not because she had to, but because for the first time in years she could. As Elena stood, her spine not perfectly straight, her dress still damp at the bottom, her shoulders still bearing invisible weight, an unsettling stillness settled over the venue. Not even the clinking of silverware or the soft shuffle of shoes filled the space. The silence was no longer awkward. It was reverent, observant, as though everyone collectively realized they had just witnessed something that didn't belong to the script of this evening. The groom, still holding Elena's hand, turned to face the crowd. His fiancée, his now former fiancée, was nowhere to be seen. She had stormed out moments earlier, wrapped in rage and humiliation, but the groom hadn't flinched. He hadn't called her back or begged for forgiveness. He had simply stayed. With Elena, a voice from the crowd, older, unsure, cracked the silence. "Is she someone important to him?" Another voice followed. This one younger, softer, almost ashamed. "She looks familiar. Didn't she used to work at that bookstore near the park?" No one answered aloud, but a murmur of recognition rippled through the guests, slowly replacing judgment with memory. Faces began to shift. People remembered her not as a homeless woman, but as someone who used to smile when she handed over your change. As someone who used to read while waiting for the bus, rain or shine. As someone who had been, before she became someone people looked through. The wedding singer, unsure what else to do, strummed a single note on his guitar, and the sound, so painfully out of place, drew a chuckle from someone in the back. And that was all it took. The tension broke, not with a grand gesture, but with a ripple of humanity. A woman approached Elena with a shawl. A man offered her a seat. Others avoided her eyes but shuffled slightly, embarrassed by their earlier stares. And then came the most unexpected moment of the night. The groom took the microphone from the DJ's booth. His voice was calm but clear. "This wasn't the wedding I planned," he began, glancing at Elena with a look that held both apology and admiration. "But maybe ... it's the one I needed." He paused. We spend so much time building events that look perfect. But we forget that the best moments in life, the ones that matter, don't come with matching flowers or polished speeches. They come when you recognize someone who made you better once, and you decide not to look away again. No applause, no cheers. Just quiet. The kind that means people are actually listening. And Elena? She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply stood there, letting herself be seen. Fully. Finally. The bride was gone. But something real had taken her place. Years ago, just a few blocks away from the heart of the city, tucked between a closed-down diner and an old florist, there stood a quiet little bookstore, unassuming on the outside, but a universe of untold stories within. It was the kind of place where the floor creaked with every step and the scent of aged paper lingered like an old friend. Elena wasn't just a cashier there. She was the soul of the place. She knew which book could comfort a heartache, which poem could spark hope, and which biography could inspire someone who had given up. One cold January afternoon, the door chimed and a young man walked in, soaked in rain, lost in thought. That man was Daniel. Back then, he was far from the confident figure who would one day own a multi-million-dollar publishing empire. He was just a university dropout with a broken sense of direction and a notebook full of unfinished stories. Elena didn't judge. She offered him a dry towel, a warm cup of coffee, and a book of short stories that, according to her, knew how to listen better than people did. What started as occasional visits soon became daily conversations, sometimes about literature, sometimes about life, and sometimes about nothing at all. Daniel found in Elena not just a friend, but a rare kind of stillness that allowed his mind to breathe. She challenged his cynicism without ever raising her voice. She believed in his talent before he ever dared to, and she reminded him that stories mattered, even the unfinished ones. But life, with its cruel sense of irony, doesn't always reward kindness in the moment. When the bookstore closed down due to debt, Elena disappeared without a word. Daniel searched for her. For months he walked by the same alley, hoping to hear the creak of the bookstore door again, but she was gone. And the one person who had truly seen him, really seen him, became a memory that haunted the quiet corners of his mind for years. Now, standing in that grand ballroom filled with diamonds and champagne, Daniel looked into the eyes of the woman being asked to leave, and it all came crashing back. The bookstore, the coffee, the poems. It wasn't just any woman, it was her. And for a brief second the noise of the room faded, the laughter died, and all that remained was the truth. He owed everything he had become to the very woman they were trying to humiliate. Daniel didn't hesitate. While the murmurs grew louder and eyes darted between him and the disheveled woman security had cornered, he strode to the stage with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The ballroom, a monument to elegance and status, suddenly felt like the wrong place to remain silent. His hands, usually steady during speeches and shareholder meetings, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to be said. He took the microphone from the startled MC, whose plastered smile flickered with uncertainty. The crowd quieted not because they respected him, but because they were curious about what a man like Daniel Whitaker, known for calculated business moves and carefully rehearsed speeches, might possibly have to say at his own engagement celebration. But he didn't look at them. He looked at her, at Elena, and then he turned to the audience. "I know what this looks like," he began, his voice firm yet unpolished, as though the truth had never before demanded this kind of raw delivery. "A woman who doesn't belong. Someone you assume wandered in off the street, maybe looking for warmth, maybe for food. Maybe she doesn't even know why she came, but I do." He paused not for drama, but because the memory gripped his throat. "You see a stranger. I see the person who gave me the courage to become who I am. Years ago, I walked into a small bookstore, wet, broke, and convinced I had nothing worth giving to this world. And there she was, behind a dusty counter, offering me not just a book or a towel, but belief. Belief in stories, belief in kindness, and somehow, belief in me." There was no applause. No interjections. Just silence. She didn't ask for anything. Not money, not praise, and certainly not pity. But tonight, I saw her being treated like she didn't matter, like she was a disruption to our perfect little world. And I realized if I stayed quiet, I'd be betraying the very values I'd built this life upon. The bride-to-be, a poised woman in a silver gown with eyes growing colder by the second, stepped forward and hissed his name, but he didn't flinch. "Elena," he said, turning to her once more, "you don't deserve to be thrown out. You deserve to be honored." And with that, he did something that stole every breath from the room. He stepped off the stage, walked straight to her, and took her hand steady, deliberate, and without shame. The photographers didn't know whether to keep snapping or lower their cameras. The bride, now pale and furious, stormed out of the hall without a word. And Daniel? He just held Elena's hand tighter and whispered, "This time I won't lose you again." They stood there, hand in hand, for longer than anyone dared to move. The lights in the ballroom, once celebratory and golden, now seemed to isolate them in a harsh spotlight, like they had stepped out of a fantasy and into a reckoning. Whispers crawled through the crowd like smoke. Some gasped, some scoffed. A few took hesitant steps back, unsure if they were witnessing a scandal, a breakdown, or the start of something entirely new. Daniel didn't waver. He adjusted his jacket with his free hand, nodded once to the band that had gone quiet, and turned back to Elena. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with disbelief. Her fingers gripped his hand tighter, as if expecting this to be a cruel illusion that would vanish the moment she blinked. But he didn't let go. "We're leaving," he said to no one in particular. "Not because we're ashamed, but because we don't belong in a room that applauds appearances and condemns humanity." And with that they walked. The marble floor beneath them echoed their steps louder than the music ever had. They passed tables filled with crystal glasses, untouched plates of gourmet food, and people too stunned to remember the masks they had worn to this masquerade of wealth. Elena didn't look down. She didn't flinch when a woman in a red gown gasped theatrically, or when a man whispered something cruel behind a raised champagne flute. She just walked beside Daniel, head held high, not because she felt she belonged, but because he made her feel seen, really seen. Not as a homeless woman or an old flame or a mistake from the past, but as someone worthy. The double doors at the entrance creaked open. The cold air outside hit them like a promise. It smelled of rain and pavement and freedom. Elena turned to him for the first time since the moment on stage and finally spoke quietly, but with all the clarity the ballroom had lacked. "You just lost everything," she said, her voice trembling. "Your wedding, your reputation, your entire life, for me." Daniel smiled softly, almost painfully. "I didn't lose anything. I just remembered what matters." She didn't cry. Not then. But her lip quivered as she stepped forward and pressed her forehead to his chest. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to be held. And for the first time ever, Daniel wasn't performing for an audience. He wasn't posing for a camera. He wasn't playing a role. He was just a man who finally made the right choice. Outside the grand hall, under the fading glimmer of city lights and the cold breath of a late-night breeze, Daniel and Elena stood at the edge of a new beginning. Behind them, the wedding was still technically underway, guests murmuring, gossiping, trying to understand how a perfectly planned night unraveled the moment he reached for her hand. But none of that mattered anymore. They didn't speak. For several minutes, they just stood silently, the weight of what had happened beginning to settle like dust after a storm. Elena was still barefoot, her feet raw from the cold pavement, but she didn't flinch. She had walked through worse. Daniel took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, not as a gesture of charity, but of recognition. She wore it differently than his tailored bride ever could. It looked like it belonged to her. A car pulled up, sleek and black, one of the fleet hired for the evening. The driver hesitated as he lowered the window. "Mr. Dalton, do you need a ride?" Daniel didn't even glance back at the hotel. "No, but she does. And I'll be going with her." They got in together, and the door shut with a finality that didn't feel like an ending, but rather the true beginning of his story. Inside the car, Elena curled into the jacket's warmth, watching the lights of the city streak by. She didn't ask where they were going. She just watched him, this man who once walked past her on the street like she was invisible, and now had set fire to his reputation just to remind her she was not. Daniel looked ahead, eyes unfocused, lost in thought. "They'll crucify me tomorrow," he said. "The press, my board, my family. They'll say I lost my mind." Elena tilted her head. "Did you?" He turned to her, a half-smile forming. "No, I think I've finally found it." They drove in silence again until Elena's voice cracked through it. "Why me, Daniel? After all these years? After all the people you could have chosen to make a statement with, why the girl who begged at your hotel gate?" His voice dropped lower than it had all night. "Because you didn't just ask for help that day. You looked me in the eye and made me feel like I was the one who needed saving." The car pulled to a stop not at his penthouse, not at any glittering venue, but outside a small, quiet diner at the edge of the city. Neon lights flickered above chipped windows. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even warm. But it was real. He opened the door for her and held out his hand, not to lead her, but to walk beside her. "Come on," he said. "Let's rewrite the ending." Inside the old diner, the smell of burnt coffee and buttered toast greeted them like an old friend who never asked where you'd been. There were no violins, no champagne towers, no polished speeches. Just a worn-out waitress who barely looked up, a buzzing neon sign that flickered the word "open," and two people who had finally stepped outside the boundaries of expectation. Daniel slid into the booth across from Elena. For the first time that night, the confidence he wore like armor gave way to something quieter. not weakness, vulnerability. A kind of strength he'd never dared to use before. Elena stared at the menu but didn't read it. She wasn't hungry. Not for food, anyway. He broke the silence. I remember you. She blinked. What? That night, 3 years ago. Outside the Ritz. It was snowing, and I had just signed the contract that made me a millionaire. You asked for $1. Her face flushed. She looked down at her hands, embarrassed. I didn't give it, he said. Not because I didn't have it, but because I didn't know how to see you. And you looked straight at me like I already should have. She lifted her head. And tonight, I saw you. They didn't touch. There was no dramatic kiss. But something far more intimate happened. He reached across the table and placed a crumpled photo in her hands. It was old, faded, taken at an orphanage benefit he had attended as a teenager. In the background was a little girl barefoot, staring at the cake she didn't have permission to eat. That's you, isn't it? Her fingers trembled. He nodded. You were there the day my mother donated that building. I remember seeing you. And even back then, something about your eyes stayed with me. I guess I'd been chasing that look my whole life. She didn't cry. She just exhaled, as if years of shame and silence had finally been allowed to leave her lungs. The waitress came over, placed 2 mugs of watery coffee in front of them, and shuffled away. Neither of them touched it. Daniel leaned forward, voice steadier now. I don't want a fairy tale. I don't want to save anyone. I just want someone who reminds me who I am when the noise fades. And that's you, Elena. It always was. She smiled, not the shy, guarded smile of someone grateful, but the fearless grin of someone who'd been tested and survived. You sure you're ready to walk away from the life they built for you? He nodded. It wasn't mine to begin with. They left the diner an hour later, not hand in hand, not running into the sunrise, but walking side by side down a quiet street that smelled of rain and possibility. By the time the tabloids woke up screaming, by the time the photos surfaced and the outrage began, Daniel and Elena were long gone, 2 strangers who had once passed each other in silence, now rewriting the story the world tried to script for them. And somewhere, in the heart of the city, a wedding photo was being torn apart, not by scandal, but by truth. Because the real love story didn't happen in a ballroom. It happened in a booth, over cold coffee and warm memory, between a man who had everything and a woman who finally stopped apologizing for having nothing.